think 6 questions. One, what is a research statement? The second one is, why do we need one? The third one is, who requests a research statement? The fourth one is, what are the key features, right? What is the structure or format of the research statement? And what do committees look for in a statement? And this is really very critical. So let's start with what is a research statement, right? So very simply, it's a summary of research achievements. Now, of course, this varies depending upon the type of job that you are applying for. So if you are a graduate student applying for a postdoc, your research statement will look slightly different than, let's say, if I'm applying as a faculty member from one university to another. Similarly, if you are a postdoc applying for an academic position or even an industry position, your research statement would look different than your graduate student research statement than a faculty student faculty's research statement. Okay, so it all depends on the type of position you're applying and at what level, at what stage of your career you are at. So it's a proposal for upcoming research, and this is very critical, right? Because, you know, if you're a postdoc and you have to think about going beyond what you've been doing as a postdoc, because one of the important things is essentially you will be applying for, let's say, an academic position. Most of you, okay, some of you will go into industry and this might change a little bit, but if you're applying to become an academic, then the research, you know, the search committee wants to find out exactly what do you think, you know, your research will be about in the future. So yes, it's good to talk about, you know, your current research, which I'll get to in a second, but it's very critical to talk about your future research, something that you're not doing as a postdoc right now. So it does include your past research findings as well as the current and future aims completely. Now, in terms of your current findings, right? So if you are a postdoc, you can certainly choose to talk about what you did as a graduate student, okay? Of course, if you're a graduate student, then you're limited to that, okay? If you are a faculty member, for example, then you don't need to talk about what you did as a graduate student. You really don't need to talk about what you did as a postdoc either, but you focus more on what you're doing now as a principal investigator, okay? But you do have the option, if you're applying as a postdoc, to include in your research statement your graduate research achievements, okay? Especially if you've gotten some really good papers and they're very exciting, you should definitely include it. But you don't really have to, okay? But as a postdoc, obviously, you know, you have to talk about what you're doing. So in addition, you know, you can talk about, obviously, your current and, again, this future, which ties up to what I said previously. It's very key, right? And I'll get to more about this future later on. Now, you can think of the research statement as really introducing yourself and your research program. And your research program, again, it could be just what you are doing right now, but some of the ideas that you have for the future. What is it exactly that you want to do when you get to University X? Okay, yes, you're doing this right now, and of course, we all know that as postdocs, you're really not doing your own work, okay? You are doing your PI's work. He or she has a grant that is funded, they have hired you as a postdoc, and you're carrying out their project. The question becomes now, what is it that you're going to do when you leave your PI's lab? Will you extend your current research? That depends on what? One of the biggest factors, I'll tell you, it's your PI. Right? Because he or she can tell you, guess what? You're not taking anything. No reagents, no project. These are mine. And then guess what? You have to start something completely new. Okay? Now, of course, most PIs are not such pig-headed individuals. They are, you know, they want to see their postdoc succeed because ultimately it reflects on them as well. So therefore, you know, they can, as you said earlier, you can take some of these ideas and branch off in a direction that is not so similar to your advisor, but, you know, it's an offshoot of that project, okay? And typically you come into agreement with your advisor, because if your advisor says, no, this is going to be mine, that's what I want to do, you cannot compete with your advisor. Sometimes people do compete with their advisors, and it's like this, and it becomes a problem, okay? Because you have to think about funding as well. Because remember, your advisor is much ahead than you are. He or she has a lot of connections in funding agencies, and if you're going to go up against your advisor in terms of funding, chances are that you will lose. Unless you're so much smarter than your advisor, so much better scientist than your advisor, then you have a good chance. Otherwise, I don't really encourage you to do anything like that. Okay, so you have to introduce yourself and your research program. Then you need to explain the importance of your research interest and findings. This is very crucial, right? Because this is really at the heart of your research statement. So in essence then, why is your research so important? Okay, what is it about your research that makes it so significant and that in comparison to the other 50 or 60 or 70 or 80 candidates that are applying for that same position at that same department, right? So what is it about your research that's going to make you stand out? Well, clearly, if you have science and nature publications, it will stand out, right? If you're not, then obviously, you have to rely on other things. So it's very important to really point to how significant your research is, right? And of course, it's good to show some data too, but we'll talk a little bit more about that, okay? So you really need to explain the importance. And you don't need, too much. It could be bullets, but we'll talk about that later. Finally, your research statement, you can think of it as really a map for your career as a scientist, because as I will talk in a little bit more in the next couple of slides, it's not just, this is what I'm going to do now or in the next year. It's essentially outline your career, okay? Typically 5 years out, but of course that 5 years will determine the next 20, 25 years. Of course, it's not always a straight path. You go in offshoots, but ultimately that central theme of your research will be there, okay? So this is basically what a research statement is all about. So now we'll go on and ask, why do we need one, okay? Why do we need one? Well, we have no choice. It is usually requested as part of your curriculum vitae, okay? Search committees basically want to hear about your research. It's part of the job. It's part of the application. So you cannot escape it. You need to write it, okay? Second, it defines you, as I said earlier, as a researcher, a scientist, or of course an engineer, right? And it helps the committee evaluate 5 things about yourself. 1, your areas of expertise. Are you a cell biologist? Are you a molecular biologist? Are you a theoretical physicist? Are you an observational astronomer? What are you, okay? So that's your area of expertise. Second, funding potential. And this is crucial, especially if you're going to an academic department. Because as in a big research university, maybe not so much in an undergraduate institution, because there the research is not to the level where it is here at Stony Brook, for example. So it's not as crucial. But if you go into a big research university, funding potential is by far, in my opinion, the #1 criterion that search committees look for, okay? Whether you will be funded, okay? Even if your science is great, if the search committee thinks you're not going to be funded because your research is great because of your advisor, not for yourself, then guess what? They're not going to give you the job, okay? They will not give you the job. Okay, so funding potential is crucial to a search committee, okay? And in fact, a lot of search committees look for funding, so you can come into the department with funding, even as a postdoc. Now, the third one, ability to conduct research. Well, this is a given, right? Obviously, you're not a postdoc if you haven't done work, but how successful are you as a postdoc? How many papers have you published, okay? And what kind of papers have you published? And this goes back also to your graduate days as well. They will look for that because they'll see, okay, this person has 2 papers as a graduate student and 2 papers as a postdoc. Well, how many years did he spend as a graduate student? 6. How many years did he spend as a postdoc? 4. That's not that impressive, okay? So the ability to conduct research is reflected in the number of publications that you have as well, because it talks about your productivity. Now, of course, we all know as professors, when we evaluate postdoctoral applications for jobs, that the lab that you're in plays a big part. So if you're in a lab that has 10 postdocs and 10 graduate students, and you have multiple collaborations, then clearly you can have more publications. Now, if you're in a smaller lab that has 2 grad students and 2 postdocs, and you have your own project and you work on your own, then clearly you will have less publications. But of course, it is the nature of the publication and also the number of authors that are part of those publications that are crucial, right? So you can have a paper with 10 authors versus a paper with just you and your PI, okay? So we look at all of that stuff, okay? We look at all that. So the ability to conduct research is crucial, okay? Fourth point, the scientific compatibility with the department or the school. This is another very big factor, because ultimately, departments are like families, okay? And you want to get along with your family members. Otherwise, there is trouble, there's turmoil. And remember, the department, not just the school, but the department makes a financial investment in you as a new faculty member, okay? So if you go there and there is trouble, and a year from now you decide to leave, guess what? The department has lost money. The school has lost money, okay? So it's very crucial that you have compatibility with the department that you're going into. Finally, research needs. So what do I mean when I say research needs? What is it that you need to do your research? Instruments. Good. What else? Well, reagents, of course, right? If your research is very unique and you need a piece of equipment, that costs $1 million, for example, well, that's tough. But, if you just need, a light microscope, that's not a big deal. Okay? So that's also another factor that search committees look for, the types of research needs. Now, of course, it also depends on your research, the nature of your research as well. Okay? And, whether you're going to need also a lot of support staff to run this piece of equipment. So it's not just getting the equipment. Well, how do you run the equipment? How do you maintain the equipment? Right? If you need some kind of a specialist that the person needs to run and maintain the equipment, guess what? Who's going to pay for that? Well, the department's going to pay for it initially, and then at some point they're going to look at you and say, you know what? When you get your grant, you're going to pay for this individual because it's your research, you deal with it. Okay? So research needs also becomes a very critical. So all of these 5 factors that I have here, this is what committees look for before they make the decision to give you the offer for that particular position. Okay? So, of course, this is mostly going from postdoc to an assistant professor position, right? So those of you that are graduate students, you really don't deal with all of them, but clearly, this is a crucial one, ability to conduct research, your area of expertise also, okay, and to some extent, compatibility, not with the department and the school, but the lab that you're going to go into, okay? So it does translate down to the students. So, your research statement convinces the committee of your potential to succeed. Remember, it's unfortunate to some extent, but this is like a business transaction. You make an investment, and what do you want to get? Some return, okay? Thank you, Lynn. Some returns, okay? And of course, the department, the school is making that commitment to you. They're making that investment in you. They want a return. So what kind of return does the school want from you as a faculty member or even as a postdoc?
Publications, money.
Well, productivity, and that can be in terms of publications or in terms of money. And I would think the first thing that they look for is money, your potential to be funded. It's unfortunate, but that's what it comes down to. How much money can you bring to the department, to the university? Okay, because with money, you hope that the publications will come, but that's not always the case. I've seen a lot of people with a lot of money and the publication records are not that impressive. Okay? So, what else do they look for besides money and publications? Of course, you know, it doesn't have to be about research, right? What was it? Teaching, right? Okay, yes, teaching is another thing. Okay, and of course, going back to research, you know, this, you know, how, what kind of an impact will your research have, you know, in generally speaking, and how will that affect the department, okay? And you know, also, there's one other critical one. Mentor. As a mentor, right? This is very critical, okay? Because guess what? Even if you have money and you're a horrible person, you're not going to attract students, all right? So you can have the money, you're going to have an empty lab. You're not going to be productive. You're not going to be able to get the publications, which of course, then later on, it will affect you in getting funding, okay? So the ability to be a good mentor has to come through your research, okay? But of course, you know, this comes first, and then if you get the interview, then of course your talk becomes very critical, which of course we have already covered that. Okay, so this is why we need a research statement. So now let's talk a little bit about who requests it. Well, as I said earlier, basically it is requested by the search committee. It is part of your job applications, part of your CV, right? And these are some of the statements that you may run into job advertisements. For example, they'll say, applicants should submit a statement of research interests, right? Because most of the time they will expect multiple projects, not just one, but multiple ones. Second, research plan, okay? That's very general, research plan. Then you have, you know, something that's a little bit more specific, like statement of research accomplishments. So in this case here, you might break it down by graduate student, postdoc. And even if you are a young assistant professor that's looking to make a transition, then you're, you know, as your academic, when you are a professor. There is another one even more specific. Statement of research interests and accomplishments and future research plans. Guess what? You need to provide all three. Okay? If they specify, you need to have that. Okay? And then finally, some of them will be even more specific, like brief 1 to 3 page statement of the candidate's 5-year research plan. Okay? So now you have to think about 5 years into the future, what is it that you want to be doing? Okay? That, of course, is different than what your advisor is doing right now. And hopefully you'll know where your advisor is going, so you don't go in the same direction, you go in a different direction. Because sometimes search committee members will know your advisor, and they'll have an idea where your advisor is going. So if it's too much in alignment with where your advisor is going, that's not going to reflect very well in your application. Okay? So basically, all of these are variations on the same theme, right? And the theme is essentially, you know, what your research interests are, your accomplishments, and the future research plans, typically 5 years out. Yes?
For a grad student applying for a postdoc, what would be the...
Right. So the question is, for graduate students applying for a postdoc, what would this be? Can anybody answer that question? Right, so the statement of research interests, right? But it could also talk a little bit about your accomplishments as a graduate student, okay? Now, so you're not going to talk about future research plans to the level that you're applying for an assistant professor position, okay? Because you are limited, because you're going to a laboratory that's going to work on a specific project that your PI will give you, right? So basically, but you will focus a lot more on your research interest, because as a postdoc, what you're trying to do is sell yourself based upon what you know, your expertise. So if you're a molecular biologist Well, what kind of molecular biology techniques are you familiar with? Okay, is it just 2 of them or is it 10 of them, right? And then, you know, you look at the publications to see the diversity of your techniques that you published, okay? So that changes from going from student to postdoc, okay? Let's talk a little bit then about what are the key features of a research statement, okay? And of course, the first one is that you want to have a brief description of the general research area. And as you'll see, even in mine, I have this top paragraph there. That's just a general description. And then you get into some of the important research contributions that you have amassed, right? So, you know, which of course, this describes your research. And then specific areas of expertise. So what are your expertise? You know, again, are you a molecular biologist? And if you're a molecular biologist, what exactly is it that you are you focusing on? Are you focusing on sort of transcription factors? Are you focusing on cell cycle regulation? What is it, okay? So these are the kind of things, the specific areas of expertise. Long and short-term research goals, which we've covered before, okay? And the importance and implications of your research, past, current, and future, right? And here you can include approaches, right? Because science is not static. It's a highly dynamic field, right? And of course, there are always new techniques that come about. So the search committee will look for your ability to be able to use cutting-edge techniques, right? So for example, I will use the example that I'm very familiar with, gene expression. Okay, so now, there are many ways that a scientist can monitor the expression of a gene. Okay? Now, the old-fashioned way, back when I was a graduate student, we use what we call northern blots. Now, we have PCR. Okay? Not only PCR, but we have quantitative PCR. So, if you're going to write down that you're going to do northern blots, you know, that's a problem, right? So you want to be able to use cutting-edge techniques, okay? So that's what we mean here by approaches, okay? How do you approach the question, the research that you're trying to achieve? What types of approaches, what types of methods, techniques that you use? Yes?
So if you have a really diverse background
yes.
In terms of interests, is it better to include more diversity
Oh.
so you get
well, it's a double-edged sword, because if you're too diverse, then they're going to tell you that you're not focused enough.
Right.
All right? So you got to be very careful. I would not, if you're a postdoc, I would not advise you to have more than 2 or 3 sort of defined projects.
Is it okay if it's sort of chronological? So if you did sort of different things?
Yes. No, that's fine. If it's past, then you should show all of them.
Okay.
Or I was thinking more about the future.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
So
your future interest should be more focused.
yes, absolutely. Yes, the past is fine, because you know what? It shows that you are basically, you know, willing to collaborate, and you've got your hands wet in 5, 6 different fields, or 5, 6 different research projects, and that's great. But ultimately, for the future, you need to be more focused, right? I saw your hand, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask, so what if it's something that you want to do that you don't know how to do, or you don't have any proof?
Right.
But essentially it's either a new technique that has come out fairly recently,
Yeah.
or something that you like to bring into your field.
And that's fine. You can talk about that. That's great. It shows that you're an innovative thinker. It shows that you have the ability to come up with novel approaches, and that's very desirable as well, as long as they are feasible. Okay, so that's also a double-edged sword. You don't want to be able to propose something that is so, you know, out of the realm of reality that, you know, they're going to look at you and say, yeah, he's a dreamer. So you got to be very careful.
But can you write that you can do collaborations?
Absolutely. And if you have your collaborators lined up, that's even better. Absolutely. Absolutely. Good. Great questions. Okay, now, this is very critical too, right? Again, going from postdoc to a faculty position. If your research fits with a particular funding agency, whether it's the National Institutes of Health, whether it is the National Science Foundation, whether it is NASA, whether it is the Army, the Office of Naval Research, whether it is a private foundation, whatever, right? If it fits well, you can list the agency or agencies and briefly outline a proposal. So you can say, in this particular project, I think that if I extend my project to include the following specific aims, I think this will be funded by the National Institutes of Health, for example, a particular branch of the National Institutes. You can be very specific. It doesn't have to be general like NIH, but which institute of the NIH? Is it NIAMS? Is it NIDDK? Is it NIBIB? Whatever, okay? So you can do that. And that shows also two things. What are those two things? That if you did this, what does it show? Yes, you're moving forward with your ideas. Well,
where you can get the money from.
right, it shows you that you can, have potential funding from a specific place. And third thing, it shows that you thought about these things. And this is very critical because once you make the transition, remember, as a postdoc, you don't really think too much about funding. Why? Because funding is already covered by your PI, okay? Both for your salary and for your research, okay? So you really don't think about it. So the search committee, they really want you to see that you're beginning now to make the transition from a postdoc, which requires one type of thinking, to an independent principal investigator, which now requires another type of thinking. All right? And it's very crucial that this comes out in your research statement, and it's very crucial that this comes out at your interview, in your presentation that you'll do when you have the interview. Okay? So, research statement structure. Okay. So, ideally, there are 6 or 7 things that I'm going to list here. One is the executive summary. You can think of this as an abstract because executive summary sounds like some business plan, and this is not a business plan, although it requires money and it deals with funding, right, which is all about money. So this is not required, but it can be useful. And as you can see in mine, I have one on the top. It's like a little, that basically defines broadly what your research interest, broadly, right? And then you can make it more specific later on. So this is like a broad, general statement about your research interest. The background, right? Now the background focuses on previous research, okay? So again, if you're a postdoc, you can talk about that. If you are, an assistant professor applying to another university, then you can talk about the stuff that you did as an assistant professor. Okay, the current research, and this can include some of the results, the key results, obviously, you're not going to show everything, the significance of your research, and some of the promising lines of inquiry. So where do you want to go, right? Where is this research leading you to, right? And more importantly, it has to show independence. Independence from who? Your PI, right? It has to show independence from your PI. Yes, when I was a postdoc, I worked on A, B, C, but now I'm going to work on, X, Y, Z. Okay, so when I was a postdoc, I worked in neuroscience. I was at Caltech. I spent 4 years there, and I worked on cell and molecular biology in terms of both Schwann cells and neurons. Okay, but then when I made the transition here to Stony Brook, I completely switched fields, and I got into molecular cell biology of the musculoskeletal system. So for me, there was no issue. Okay, there was no issue because I wasn't doing anything my advisor did. Okay? It's a completely different field. Now, that's more difficult because you're really making a complete shift. Okay? So you could do that too. Future research agenda, again, anywhere up to 5 years. Nobody will ask you to tell me what you're going to do in 20 years. They're not going to do that. So 3 to 5 years. Again, short and long-term goals. Short being closer to the 3 years, longer being the 5-year. Right? And again, how do you link your research to funding agencies? If it fits, put it in. If it doesn't fit, then obviously you don't want to make a mistake and say, I'm going to do this clinical project and I'm going to apply for NSF funding because we all know NSF funding, NSF does not fund clinical studies. Okay? So, you don't want to show them that you're clueless. Okay? So you got to be very careful. Okay, summary. It's always nice to have a summary, sort of whether it's bullets or whatever you want to do it, A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, right, of the most important aspects of your work. And you can break this down, by graduate. In my graduate stuff, these are the highlights of my research, 1, 2. When I was a postdoc, these are the highlights of my research, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So this is very critical. So these are the most important aspects. In other words, what are the key elements of your past research? Tell me about them, right? 2, 3 bullets, that's about it, okay? At the end, as a summary. And then finally, you want to talk a little bit about relevance to the department, school, institution, discipline, and society. When I say society, not the general society, but the society of the area of research that you're willing. So if you're doing neuroscience, it would be the Society for Neuroscience. If you're doing, bioengineering, it would be Biomedical Engineering Society, okay? Chemistry, whatever. Okay, so the point here is what? The point of this relevance, it shows that you thought about where you're applying, and you took the time to look into the department to see what other professors in that department are doing and whether you can fit, and when I say fit, propose some collaboration. So you can say, you know what, if I go to the biomedical engineering department, there are 3 professors there that I can see myself collaborating with, okay? And if you're even smarter, you can say, and here are 3 projects that I would use with these 3 professors. I'm going to do this with this professor, I'm going to do that with this professor, and I'm going to do this with this professor. And possibly, if we're successful, we can go for funding to NIH, NSF, some private foundation. Okay? So it shows that you care, you've done your homework, you've looked into it, you've identified possible collaborations, and it talks about this future funding as well. So obviously, you're not going to advance your idea that much. You can just simply say that there are 3 professors that I could see myself collaborating with, right? So you're not going to go into great detail because that's not the point there, okay? But it's nice because, again, it shows you that you've done your homework, you've identified potential collaborators, and it's very critical to have collaborators because remember, the days where we went into our lab and shut the door behind and we were all by ourselves, those days are over. Nobody works like that anymore, right? Everything, you look at papers now, how often do you see 2 authors on a paper? Very seldom, right? Even more seldom you see 1 author, unless it's a review. But if it's a research paper, almost never now, right? Typically you have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 authors. Okay, because everything is about collaborations. Okay, so the relevance becomes very critical as well. Yes. The question is, if you think you're going to collaborate with one of the professors in the department, is it better to mention that in the cover letter, or is it better to put it here in the research statement? You could put it in both places. There's nothing wrong with that, because it shows in the cover letter that you thought about fitting into the department as well, and they see it first, and that's nice, and then they look for it here, okay? But if you put it there and you don't put it here, that's not good. So you got to be consistent, right? You got to be consistent. Yes. Okay. So the research statement format, the writing should be clear and concise, chronological. Again, grad school. Even if you did some work as an undergraduate, you can work that in a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that, especially if you had a publication out of it. That's even better, okay? And you have to use headings, subheadings, bullets, and you can bold some of the important points. These are typical stuff that we do, right? Never write these long, 1-page long paragraphs. It's just too dense of a material. So typically you want to keep it 1/3 of a page, maybe tops half a page, right? And again, each project should be a different section or research interest if you don't have projects, right? And it should be labeled, and you'll see mine in just a second, right? You can include data. Now, if you're, again, young in age and experience, and you could show that. If you're like me, you don't need to show data, you just show the publications, and that's good enough. People can go look at your papers, right? I don't need to show them a graph with something, okay? You can cite your own publications as well as those of others. This is very critical because, again, this is you. It's about you, your research accomplishments, your future, right? This is very critical. You're not bragging, right? Again, you can use, this is one time where you can say I, okay? Even though you had collaborations, it's very important to say I, use the first person, because this is about you. You're selling yourself. And aim for 2 to 3 pages. If you really have a lot, like you see mine is like 4.5 pages because of the different number of projects, right? Now, if you're really not sure, because they said just research statement, you can always call the chair of the committee if you know. Typically, it tells you who the chair of the committee because that's where you're going to send your application to, right? So you can call, you can email the person and say, you know, what is your expectation for the research statement? 2 pages, 3, 5? So this way you have a guideline, and then you're able to plan a much better research statement, right? Because, you know, if you don't know and they have in mind, you know, 3, 4 pages and you give them 1 page, that's not going to look good. And then other candidates come in with 3 or 4. Okay, so there's nothing wrong by asking. Okay, so a little bit more about this, right? You want to be brief, clear, succinct, focused, solid, thoughtful, readable, right? You want to be creative, pragmatic, careful, honest, credible, logical, strategic, okay? And the last thing, you need to get feedback from your advisor and other senior colleagues, not just other postdocs, but other professors in the department. Perhaps you've collaborated with other professors in the department. Get their opinion. Let them help you streamline your research statement, right? And of course, proofread, right? Don't send in with spelling errors or other grammatical errors. That does not reflect good on you, okay? Because it shows that you did not take the time to go over the document and corrected the problems. All right, so your future, what do committees look for? We covered a lot of these. Your future research direction, potential for funding. Again, research accomplishments, right? You look at your publication record. That's going to be in your resume as well, your CV. How well you fit in the department, not just in terms of research activities, but personality and expertise. Look, if I'm a molecular biologist and I'm going to the department and there are 4 other molecular biologists, that's not really good. But if I'm a molecular biologist and I go into the department and there is no molecular biologist, that's excellent, okay? That's excellent. So, and of course, personality, okay? This is very critical, okay? You're going to work with these people for years, okay? You're going to deal with them. Okay? So this has to be a fit.